The MCU spent over a decade succeeding because they don't make superhero movies. They make genre films with superheroes in them. Ant-Man was a heist film, Guardians of the Galaxy was a comedy and a space western, Winter Soldier was a spy movie, and like it or not, Black Panther was a Shakespearean epic. DC is trying to make superhero films. Now, while their animated series and TV are doubtlessly top of the game, really, they need a reboot for their film universe, and the best way to do that is with the ultimate buddy comedy. That's right. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. DC needs a time-traveling, hungover buddy picture with Booster Gold and the Blue Beetle. And it could save the DCEU. I'm Dan Umpton, and this is the Doomcast. Booster Gold and the Blue Beetle first teamed up in the pages of Keith Giffen, J.M. DeMatteis, and Kevin Maguire's Justice League, later Justice League International. Booster Gold is a 25th century washed-up athlete who stole a supersuit, flight ring, and gauntlets from a museum in the future, and Marty McFly'd his way back to the 20th century and the golden age of heroes so he could Biff Tannen his way into superheroics. Now, I've been fantasizing about this movie for decades, so 10 years ago I would have said Joel McHale or Will Arnett, but now for Booster I'd cast Ingrid Goes West's Billy Magnuson. Square-jawed, he's good at playing a smug jerk, and he's got great comic timing. He more than has the acting chops, physique, and blonde hair for Booster Gold. Blue Beetle, is Ted Kord, a Charlton Comics creation, second of his name, inventor, genius, goofball. The two were frequent comic relief in the pages of an epic but very often funny take on Justice League, with Batman, Martian Manhunter, and Guy Gardner at the helm. Now, for Ted, I honestly would have cast Paul Rudd before Ant-Man. But if I'm casting Ted now, I gotta go with New Girl's Jake Johnson, because he has that good blend of believable sarcasm and wit, and a guy that's just smart enough to be a scientist, but also just dumb enough to be friends with Booster. Now, this is likely never to happen. It's totally my own fantasy. So, just in case Warner Brothers ever approached me to write this movie, here's how it would go. Booster Gold comes to the 20th century. He's confronted by a new hero who calls himself the Blue Beetle, a guy named Ted Kord, who built a flying beetle and beetle suit from a scarab heirloom that his father had gifted to him, which had been gifted to him by a friend named Dan Garrett. Down on his luck inventor, whose venture capital bailed on him a decade ago, leaving him destitute, the Blue Beetle is a young man with a big heart, no powers, and nothing to lose. Booster Gold is frustrated that he met a hero he knows nothing about because he knows everything about the golden age of heroes, and Beetle is convinced that Booster is a criminal. The two find themselves initially at odds, but then discover that the history that Booster Gold remembers isn't at all what Ted's lived through. When Booster remembers that there's real beer in the 20th century, the two of them sit down to a six-pack. Booster explains that the destruction of Metropolis, Batman vs. Superman, the Justice League film, happened contrary to what he remembers and everything that he'd seen in history. Batman was younger, the Flash was older, Wonder Woman was still awesome, and Steppenwolf never attacked Earth. And he remembers Green Lanterns, Hawks, Martian Manhunters, and New Gods. On a drunken tour of his time machine, Beetle accidentally sends them 80 years into the past. The two attempt to find a way to recharge the time machine, stranded in the 1930s, running into an archaeologist named Carter Hall and a man named Kent Nelson, Dr. Fate, the latter of which is aware of the fact that they are from a future timeline. But when Ted discovers Booster's original intention to become rich and famous, the two have a falling out. Ted, now convinced that Booster was always a scam artist. After finding a lantern made of green metal that Dr. Fate informed them would charge the time machine just enough to get them back home, Ted steals the time machine, leaving Booster in the 1930s, on a train with a man named Alan Scott. While Ted races back to discover that his present is controlled by Darkseid, parademon infested, the future that Batman had a vision of in Batman vs. Superman, he seeks out the same lantern in the wreckage of a train yard, and charges the time machine just enough to get back to Booster to make sure that Alan Scott comes in contact with that selfsame lantern, changing the entire timeline. Racing back to the future, they see the past of their universe reform around them. Jay Garrick becomes the first Flash, Hawkman, Dr. Fate, and the Spectre form the Justice Society of America, with the first Black Canary. And returning to the present, Cord finds himself the president of a successful tech company, the controlling interest in the company that would have been if his falling out with his venture capital hadn't occurred a decade earlier in his timeline. And they're surrounded by a bigger, brighter metropolis, a world with a 70-year legacy of superheroes. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman at the helm of a new league with Green Lantern, Hawkman, Big Barda, and Mr. Miracle, and of course Dr. Fate, who knew that this was what it was going to take to restore the timeline all along. A league that welcomes them as new provisional members, just in time to confront the looming threat, Brainiac. Now, of course, this is just wishful thinking on my part, because this movie is probably never going to happen. So I've lifted some bits here and there from my Doomsday Clock and Justice League International and some of my other favorite DC books, of course, Hawkman and Dr. Fate. But without a hard reset, DC is going to struggle to tell the stories that make it great and bright. And those aren't origin stories, because most people are familiar with these characters already, and the ones that you do need to introduce might take 30 seconds to explain. It's time to bring two of DC's funnest characters to the screen and clean the slate for a true Justice League film. Now, this is the 250th episode that I've done, so I've got to give some shout-outs. Of course, Kurt and Kyle Porter were the people that let me do this to begin with, and I've carried it on after Capes. I really appreciate everybody who's continued watching, my good friends and recurring guests like Lloyd Belt, Perry Thompson, Brian Weber, Tristan Landers, of course my good friend Mike Albert, and my good buddy Luke Roth, who was one of the first people that recognized me from doing this and just this and not comedy. And of course folks like Ben Brujo and Anthony Corrado, who have continued watching from way away from where I started doing this whole thing. I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much if you've been on this or you've shared anything. You know, I really appreciate doing this. It's very enriching, and sometimes it's frustrating, and sometimes it's a lot of work, but it's always fulfilling. Here's to 250 episodes, and I think I'll probably do 250 more and end at 500. Thanks everybody for watching. This has been the Doomcast. We'll see you next week.